Mm. Hello, everybody. How are you? Hi, Dolores. Hi, Sandy. How are you? Hi, Matt. Romano says, "Greetings, beautiful people. Just got done cooking, eating salmon croquettes and rich, cheesy grits with curry butter." Is curry butter Irish butter? What did you all have for dinner? Well, what I made for dinner was a kind of rice cauliflower mash with some white beans and also tomatoes. And I had a few hearts of palm left over from some salad that our son gifted us with over the weekend. And I put that into the dish. And then I topped it all off with some pesto sauce that Bonnie had made some time ago. And it turned out to be delicious, even though I forgot the cheese, the Parmesan cheese for it. Anyway. Hi, Amberly. How are you? Kay says, "Hi all, watching Bernie's town hall on climate change, so I'll be in and out for a while." Yeah, I was watching that too. I was happy to see Jay Inslee on there. And William Wallace Wells. That was good. And Varshini Prakash, God, when you just hear her voice, I was sitting in one room and she was talking, okay, in another. When you just hear her voice and hear her speak, she sounds just like Ocasio-Cortez. She really does. I mean, the pattern and cadence of speech, okay, the two, okay, are a similar age. It was just uncanny. Anyway, Kay says, "As far as the so-called HEROES Act, Pelosi bailed out her lobbyists and we the people are once again screwed." Lori Keller says, "Hello, hi Lori, and welcome." And Rick Maynard says, "Evening all. Well, it took me a couple of minutes, but I figured out how to do 2 Zoom meetings at the same time." Oh, wow. Bonnie's joined. Hi, honey. And Stacy Van Veen has joined. Michael Osweiler is here. He's joined. So thank you all for coming. And we'll go on. There's a lot to cover tonight. Okay, a lot of it is about the HEROES Act and the pros and the cons and the process of how we got to the HEROES Act, which is, as we shall see, a horrible process. But what I want to call your attention to, first of all, is a YouTube which appeared today by Nicole Sandler, who was interviewing Stephanie Kelton. And it's too long, okay, an interview to play. But I didn't want to call your attention to it because Stephanie was very, very good and very clear, okay, on this one. And she had a decent period of time to talk. Okay, it was actually close to a half hour. I think Stephanie's part of it starts about 34 minutes in. Okay, so I recommend that you see this. I've linked to the video in the description because the video is very much relevant to what we're talking about here tonight, and also to background and to what is going to follow on the issues that we talk about here tonight. So I wanted to call your attention to it and to tell you that you have the link. Okay, it's in the description. So I did forget to share that, so momentarily I will share the screen with you so you can see what the front of the video is actually looking like. And there is Nicole Sandler, whose Thursday shows are often very funny because she has Howie Klein on Thursday, about 30 minutes into the show. And he's the guy who's dubbed Chuck Schumer as Little Chucky Schmucky. So usually they talk a lot about Little Chucky Schmucky on that show. Anyway, I'll stop sharing that now. And I'm going to go on to the second piece we'll cover tonight. I'll share that in just a minute. I want to pull up another couple of articles while I'm at it here. So, I wanted to go into this piece of background on the unemployment situation, which I've talked a lot about here before. And I'm pulling up this particular article by Jack Rasmus, who's an economist. He was in Jill Stein's shadow cabinet for the Green Party back in 2012 and 2013. Jack is a pretty good economist, okay, and a pretty good writer. Okay, he's not an MMT economist, okay, by any means, but he's very good, okay, on unemployment, as okay, I think we'll see. This is an article from Counterpunch today, May 13th, 2020. It's called "Lowballing the Unemployed in the Era of the 2020 Great Recession." I think he's underestimating that. I think we're in a depression. And I don't know if it's going to be as deep or last as long as the 1930s depression. I hope not. But right now, he seems to agree that the unemployment rate, the real unemployment rate, is at depression levels right now. So, he says this past Friday, the U.S. Labor Department released its latest jobless figures. The official report was 20 million more unemployed, and actually it was on Thursday that it released its latest jobless figures. Or maybe that was Friday, because he may be talking about the monthly report. I think he is. The official report was 20 million more unemployed and an unemployment rate of 14.7%. So I think he's right that it was Friday that appeared. I was thinking of the weekly jobless reports, which are generally available on Thursday morning. We're going to see another one tomorrow morning. Anyway, mainstream and progressive media reported the numbers: 20 million more jobless and 14.7%. Those numbers, as horrendous as they are, represent a gross underestimation of the jobless situation in America. One might understand, he says, why the media consistently underreports the jobless, but it's perplexing why so many progressives continue to simply parrot the official figures. Now, you'll know from my live streams that I do not parrot those figures. I mention those figures, but then I start talking about how and why they're underestimates of the true figures. And I think a few days ago I pointed out that I thought the true figures were much closer to 25% to the highest figure that they were during the 1930s Depression. Anyway, Jack goes on to say, especially when other Labor Department data admits the true unemployment rate is 22.4% and the official total unemployed is 23.1 million. Here's why the 20 million and 14.7% is a gross underrepresentation of the magnitude of the jobless today. First, he says, the 20 million of April is really only for data collected until mid-April. Nearly 10 million more jobless workers filed and received unemployment benefits after mid-April, and likely millions more jobless have been attempting to get benefits but haven't. Even officially, more than 33.5 million have filed for benefits, with several millions more in the pipeline. Several, by the way, it's not a few. It means 6 million or 7 million or something like that. And we did cover the estimate by me that we were really at 40.5 million unemployed when that report actually came out. So he says, so the April numbers of jobless, both receiving benefits and not yet getting them, are more than 20 million. He says an even greater misrepresentation is that the official 20 million unemployed actually represents only full-time workers becoming unemployed. It's a figure from the government report that is the category called U3, or full-time workers. There are between 50 to 60 million more workers who are part-time, temp, contract, gig, and otherwise contingent workers, i.e. not full-time, who are not considered in the 20 million and 14.7%. He said, check out the Labor Department's own data in Table AA, which I referred you to last time also, if you recall, which shows for March and April no fewer than 7.5 million part-time workers became unemployed. In April, jobless in this group doubled over the previous month, rising by about 5 million in April, according to the Labor Department's own monthly employment situation report. 5 million to 7.5 million represents what's called the U4 government unemployment rate, as opposed to the U3, which is what they were reporting in the 20 million and the 14.7%. But there's still more. It's what's called the U5 and U6 unemployed. I usually use the U6 myself. Who are they? They are what the government calls workers without jobs who are marginally attached to the labor force and workers who are too discouraged. They're just as jobless as full-time and part-time workers, but they're put in another category simply because they haven't actively looked for a job in the most recent 4 weeks. You see, the government defines unemployed as that subset of jobless who are out of work and actively looking for work. If you haven't looked in the past 4 weeks, you may be jobless, but aren't considered unemployed. Go figure. Add them to the U3 unemployed, and the totals for unemployed in America rise to 22.4%. Add in those filed for benefits in the last half of April, or try to, and we get closer to the publicly admitted 33.5 million without jobs and receiving unemployment benefits. Then there's the disappeared 8 million unemployed. But that's not even the whole picture, Jack says. The way the government defines unemployment, the worker must be part of the labor force. The labor force is composed of two groups, those who have jobs and those who are officially unemployed, i.e. out of work and looking for work in the past 4 weeks. If you're not looking, you're marginally attached, the U5, U6. It assumes if you have stopped looking in the past 4 weeks, you are part of the 850,000 who are marginally attached. But that figure is not credible. Somehow there are less than 1 million jobless who simply haven't tried to find a job in the last 4 weeks. Really? He says, there are many millions. A government stat that suggests there are likely millions more not in the labor force who are jobless, nonetheless is called the labor force participation rate. It estimates the percent of the working age population who either have a job or or are officially unemployed. There's approximately 164.5 million employed, officially unemployed, in the U.S. labor force as of May 1st, 2020. In February 2020, the labor force participation rate was 63.4% of the U.S. labor force. As of May 1st, that had dropped to only 60.2%. Over the past 12 months, roughly 8 million have dropped out of the labor force. And remember, if they aren't in the labor force, they can't be counted as unemployed. So where did the additional 8 million dropping out go? The U.S. government doesn't consider them unemployed, so they don't show up in the U3 or even U6 statistics. But if they aren't in the labor force, they're jobless by definition. Perhaps 850,000 are counted as the marginally attached, but what about the remaining 7.2 million or so? The government has no category for them except the estimation of them in the labor force participation rate. It tries to explain the large number by saying they retired or went back to school. But did 7.2 million, 63.4% in February, drop to 60.2% in April, retire in 2 months? And they certainly can't have gone back to school in mid-March, April of 2020. He says another government statistic that corroborates this missing 8 million in the labor force is called the employment to population ratio stat. It measures how many are in the labor force as a percent of the U.S. population of nearly 340 million. I think that's an overestimate. When I look up the U.S. population, I get 330 million. Actually, if you Google it for the estimate in this month in 2020, I suspect it's going to be around 330 million, much closer to that than it is to 340 million. Anyway, if the EPOP percentage goes down, then fewer are working, even though they're obviously still alive and part of the U.S. population. That figure has declined from 61% of the U.S. population employed to 51.3% of the U.S. population employed as of May 1st, 2020. That's a nearly 10% drop. 10% of 340 million is about 34 million. I would say, I agree with this 10%, I would say 10% of 330 million is about 33 million. And 34 million is not 20 million for April or even the Labor Department's total of 23.1 million. No, it's about another 11 million to 12 million unemployed. Okay, remember, we talked about that in previous streams. So, he says, all this suggests that the unemployed figures are grossly underrepresentations of the total Americans without jobs today, who, by the way, we might call, as I have, the disemployed. Okay. One possible reason for the discrepancies between the official unemployed of 23.1 million versus the 33.5 million who are receiving benefits, or the 7-8 million not being counted for the labor force participation rate and the EPOP, the ratio, may be due to the government in this current crisis choosing not to count as unemployed those workers forced to leave work since February to care for their dependents. And he goes back to the government's definition of unemployed, and he points out millions of workers who've been forced by the current crisis to leave their job to care for elderly and disabled family members or to care for young children forced to stay home due to school closures are not actively looking for work. But few Americans can afford nannies to watch their young children so they can work. But those in this situation are not considered unemployed by the U.S. Labor Department because they don't fit a definition of actively looking for work. It's not clear how many in this category the Labor Department has recently refused to acknowledge as officially unemployed. In America, you may be jobless, but that doesn't necessarily mean, per the government, you are unemployed. And he continues to talk about the underreporting, okay, of the unemployed. I'm not going to go through all that reading here. he says the government has a vested interest in ensuring the smoothing and underestimating the unemployed because he says it reduces government and especially business costs of programs and operations. He says if there's a conspiracy of sorts, it's in the media that purposely seems to always cherry-pick the most conservative stat to report, especially when it comes to unemployment. They do, and there is a conspiracy. Thus, we get the media trumpeting every month a nearly worthless statistic of the U3 unemployment rate, a stat that employs only the full-time workers nor as part-time temp and other contingent labor, who make up now nearly a third of the U.S. labor force. A statistic based on a narrow definition of unemployed that has become an oxymoron when estimating unemployed. A statistic based on questionable assumptions and data gathering, and a statistic that can't be reconciled with other statistics like the labor force participation rate. He's 100% correct about this, folks. 100% correct. The real unemployment rate is not the U3 figure of 14.7%, but easily 25% today. And the real total jobless are not the U3 20 million or even 23 million, but somewhere between 35 to 40 million and rising. Yes, I think I estimated a few days ago that it was actually 47.7 million already, if you took into account all those I called the disemployed. However, what's really disappointing, says Jack, is that many progressive and left economists simply parrot the government's and mainstream media's misleading U3 statistic. One can understand why the corporate, the mainstream media keep pushing the U3 stat and thus trying to make the unemployment situation look better than it is, or today not as bad as it is, but the progressive economists should know better. And so should you out there. When you quote unemployment rates and things like that, you should link to this particular post and some of my live streams and bravely tell people there are already more than 40 million who are unemployed, maybe as many as 47.7 million, and that the unemployment rate is easily 25% and may be higher than that, okay, as well. So that's very important to emphasize. So here we are. I'm gonna what's happening here? I think I did something I shouldn't. Anyway, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to get rid of that one and move you to the next one. Which is not yet quite on the HEROES Act either, but it's a warning. It's a warning I've given before, but that I want to emphasize. It's from an article in Jacobin. Coming soon, bipartisan deficit hawks calling for austerity. And when you consider the HEROES Act, you have to consider this very strongly. This is by Ari Rabin Haft, who sounds like he's an Israeli, perhaps, by background. May 12th, 2020. But he says, 4 coronavirus stimulus bills have become law, with less than 10% of the $3 trillion, or he said authorized by Congress, okay, but it's appropriated by Congress, moving directly into the pockets, okay, of workers. Instead, we got a program that purported to provide forgivable loans to small businesses to cover their payrolls, rife with institutional corruption, absolutely correct. And he says that we progressives actually received a pittance with respect to our priorities, such as debt relief for students and infrastructure spending falling by the wayside. On the other hand, centrists and Republicans feasted at the trough with tax breaks and other goodies for their K Street donors. After this spending, along with the Trump tax cuts and massive deficit spending increases, it is inevitable that within the next few months, I'd say here now, and within the next few weeks, in particular if a Democratic administration enters the White House, there will be loud cries for a new age of austerity. You can already see publications like the Fiscal Times beginning to sound the alarm while stating simultaneously right now that we probably need more fiscal support and more spending. But also, while they do that, warning that sometime soon we'll have to do something about the growing debt. Of course, they're not talking about doing something about the growing debt. What they're talking about is the need to raise taxes in order to have government austerity to pay for the growing debt. That's what they mean by do something. What I mean by doing something about the growing debt is either minting platinum coins to cover the growing debt or using overt congressional financing to pay down the no longer growing debt and simply have the debt no longer grow because take care of all deficit spending through overt congressional financing. I've talked about that quite a lot here. Won't go into it again right now except to mention it, but I go on. Republican governments feel free to spend on wars and tax giveaways going for the wealthy, powerful, and well-connected, while Democratic ones try to claim the mantle of fiscal responsibility. Right? Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic centrist, and institute often odious policy restraints in order to cut the deficit. I might have written this one myself. Consider this: the entirety of 2018 budget deficit was comprised of Bush and Trump tax cuts, direct costs of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and base defense increases. The bipartisan fiscal consensus among Washington elites was fertilized over the past few decades by Peter Peterson's Blackstone private equity fortune. It was. He made $5.5 million, and he spent over $5.5 billion, and he spent over $1 billion of it in distributions to think tanks and political institutions in Washington and New York, with audiences in both parties fomenting the ludicrous idea that there was an actual grassroots constituency around cutting the deficit. Unlike Democrats, Republicans never let deficits get in the way of the conservative wing of their party's ideological priorities. See Dick Cheney, quote, deficits don't matter, unquote. Instead, they cynically use deficits as a political weapon against the moderate Democrats, who melt down at the suggestion that perhaps the Treasury Department should issue a few more bonds so the federal government can make substantial investments in areas outside of warfare. Peterson is dead. Yes, G. Peterson is dead. But his movement lives on, and his acolytes are preparing to wage a new war against progressive policy. And there's Maya McGinnis, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, one of the chief disciples of Peter G. Peterson, who told Yahoo Finance during the last week in April, we should think about, quote, we should think about putting in place a mechanism so that when GDP is back on track and employment is back on track, we automatically go into the question of how are we going to rethink some of tax reform and rethink our spending promises and get them back so that they're not adding trillions to the debt every year, which is what we are on track to be doing right now, unquote. Well, ostensibly noting that counter-cyclical spending is necessary in time of a crisis, McGinnis' organization issued a press release condemning effective stimulus measures such as infrastructure spending and student debt cancellation as, quote, unrelated pet projects, unquote, and, quote, things that don't help us fight the virus or provide direct economic relief. The economy is in shambles. Tens of millions of people are unemployed. Our healthcare system is a nightmare. If people had 401ks, they likely took a massive hit as the stock market crashed and most people don't have enough savings to survive. Going without a paycheck at a time when going to work could literally mean contracting a deadly virus. Yet these deficit fetishists are already dismissing ideas that would bring financial assistance to tens of millions of Americans as, quote, pet projects, unquote. While constraints on spending are being ignored now, it's guaranteed that in a few months a completely theoretical notion of how much the federal government can borrow will be far more important than meeting human needs. Okay, and the take from Maya McGinnis is expected because she has spent decades waving the deficit flag. The battle of progressive lawmakers much waged is against centrists who continue to use the ruse of fiscal responsibility as a bad faith argument against what we want. While it might seem off the beaten path to start fighting an esoteric battle about the national debt as we scrape and claw for a modicum of policies in the coronavirus relief bills, failing to engage now condemns us to losing it in the future. It does not take a crystal ball to see the trite op-eds coming in January of 2021. Hell, January 2021, they're likely to come in June of 2021. They're likely only weeks away. Quote, it is about making tough choices, unquote. Quote, if your family ran up $3 trillion on the credit card, they'd have to figure out a way to pay it back, unquote. Quote, this endless orgy of spending cannot continue, quote unquote. The self-appointed guardians of fiscal responsibility will call for cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, and housing subsidies while leaving defense and large tax breaks for the wealthy and corporations intact. And by the way, Joe Biden's advisor, one of his advisors, a woman whose name I believe is Natasha Sarin, if I recall correctly, and who was a protege of Larry Summers. Both of them are advising Biden right now, is one of those who's come up with the brilliant proposal of helping people out right now by having them sacrifice some of their future Social Security benefits in order to support themselves at this point. Now, we never asked any corporations to sacrifice their future profits to borrow from future profits that they were likely to get in order to fund themselves now. We never have asked any businesses to do similar things, but of course we can always ask old people, or people who will be old at some time, to sacrifice the income during their old age and to start to spend it now. So the self-appointed guardians of fiscal responsibility will call for cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, and housing subsidies while leaving defense and large tax breaks for the wealthy and the corporations intact. Oh, here we go. There is a reference to Larry Summers calling for cuts to Social Security and Medicare at the beginning of Obama's first term. Well, he's still doing it now, but in a different format. Okay, now the article says even Summers has dropped his deficit obsession. But the status quo in Washington will be for senior members of any Democratic administration to be pushing similar policies, like Joe Biden might be doing that, or Joe Biden's favorite economist, who's probably not actually Larry Summers, it's probably Jared Bernstein. And Jared Bernstein, though he's probably not pushing any deficit type of obsession now, because he listens too much to Stephanie Kelton, might very well become very concerned about the deficit if he becomes the chief okay, of the National Economics Council during a Biden administration, as he may well become. While progressives have become fairly adept at blocking Social Security cuts, as they did during Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations, defending the status quo is clearly not good enough. And Ari says, I once witnessed a confrontation in a large conference room on the first floor of the AFL-CIO building where a senior union officer told Summers during his tenure as a White House economist, there are two types of people in this world, those who cut Social Security and those who are allowed in this building, unquote. I think that's a good line to always address Larry Summers with. The current crisis reveals that anything short of a massive increase in the social safety net is a death sentence to some of our fellow citizens. We cannot allow the hollow whining of centrists to stand in our way. And now, of course, we get at last to the HEROES Act. And I'm going to start sharing things on the HEROES Act with those two things. Okay, as background, I'm going to cover something from William Rivers Pitt on Truth Out that is favorable to the HEROES Act. Now, when you read this, you have to keep in mind that the HEROES Act is already encountering very strong opposition, and most people evaluate it as not very likely to pass because the Republicans are already stamping their feet about having to worry that there is no more money. As I indicated in my last two live streams, those tensions are already coming to the fore. Now, I still think the HEROES Act may have a chance to pass. The reason why it may have a chance to pass is because the drumbeat of continuing unemployment figures, it happens every single week. We're likely to have another 2 to 3 million newly unemployed this coming week. If the HEROES Act does not pass with its relief for state governments and for local governments, there's going to be a whole new round of new unemployment soon by state and local governments coming very, very soon, hitting very, very big, probably in the millions of people all by itself. Just the state and local government people who are being dismissed because state tax revenues have collapsed due to the crisis. Anyway, the title of this article is The HEROES Act is a Vital Step Toward Ending COVID, so of course it is doomed. And there's a picture of Nancy Pelosi. She arrived on May 12th to speak about the HEROES Act. This one was published today, May 13th, and it's part of the series Despair and Disparity, The Uneven Burdens of COVID-19. And this piece is by William Rivers Pitt, as I said. There are two ways the COVID-19 story ends for the United States. The nation can embrace scientific and medical facts as the way back home, make business secondary to life and health, and use our vast financial resources, and specifically our ability to create our own currency and our own reserves to support the populace, even as we roll out a comprehensive testing program to speed a return to whatever passes for normal in this thundercloud of a country. Or we can burn on the pyre of heedlessly rapacious capitalism. It really, truly is just that simple. As it stands, and with our current leadership, we're bound for that pyre at flank speed. An enormous majority supports the stay-at-home strictures, and huge swaths of people are sticking to them, even in states that are recklessly throwing their doors open to the virus. Excuse me just a minute while I turn on my other monitor. Okay. Fact. Donald Trump gets tested for COVID-19 multiple times a day, according to reports. The people closest to him also get tested, and if any of them show positive for infection, as several recently did, they're shuffled off to quarantine. Trump knows comprehensive testing works. He simply does not care to share the benefits with the rest of us. On Tuesday, Speaker Nancy Pelosi unveiled the beginnings of an answer to this crisis. The $3 trillion Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions Act, or HEROES Act, would be the largest relief package ever passed in the U.S. if it actually sees the light of day. It is incomplete in a number of vital areas, but it is a stupendous improvement over Trump's whistle past the overflowing graveyard plan of pretending none of this is actually happening. The bill, which is more than 1,800 pages long, 1,815 by the way, would provide $1 trillion for state, local, territorial, and tribal governments to support health workers, first responders, and teachers who are in danger of losing their jobs. Another $75 billion would provide free COVID testing, tracing, and isolation measures, and would ensure all Americans have access to free treatment if infected with COVID. But if they have another problem, it's too bad for them. They go home and die, right? The bill sets if they're not insured, of course. The bill sets $200 billion aside to provide hazard pay for essential workers who have risked their lives in the maw of the pandemic. It extends unemployment benefits to the new year at, by the way, the additional $600 per week that was originally provided by Bernie Sanders' contribution to an earlier relief bill. Okay, it also provides housing assistance for renters and homeowners and includes a 15% increase in food and in nutrition programs to combat rising hunger. The bill also includes safeguards for the upcoming election, assistance to the census process to ensure an accurate count, and preserves the standing of the Postal Service. Overall, the bill seeks to assist the millions of people who received no measurable benefit from the last relief package. The centerpiece of the bill is another 1,200 direct payments to individuals, up to $6,000 per household. As with previous relief package, this would also be a one-time payment, and that has led to some appropriately vigorous argument from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And he mentions Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley co-signing a letter to Speaker Pelosi urging the HEROES Act be modified to make such payments a recurring monthly phenomenon. There was talk of doing just that in the early stages of the bill's drafting. Senators Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, and Ed Markey proposed some legislation guaranteeing $2,000 a month monthly payment to citizens for the duration of the pandemic, but those ideas did not survive the final draft. And actually, that was in the Senate, though. They proposed that legislation in the Senate, so they weren't expected to survive the final draft of a House bill. But what might have survived the final draft of the House bill was the Jayapal Rashida Tlaib bill, which provide for the $2,000 a month for individuals in the United States and $1,000 per month more for their children before the duration of the crisis, and then $1,000 a month for individuals for 1 year after the end, of the crisis. And that, of course, was to be funded by 2 platinum coins that were mandated to be minted by this particular bill. But anyway, Jayapal has pushed back on the final version because it fails to include her Paycheck Guarantee Act. a plan to cover 100% of workers' wages up to 90,000 per year. So Ro Khanna is quoted here when he rose in defense, okay, of Jayapal's bill and said to CNN, quote, "When people say Jayapal's bill for a paycheck guarantee or recurring payments is too costly, I'd like them to explain to me why they think in a low inflation, low interest rate environment, a crisis response of spending to prevent truly massive unemployment and a shrinking of the GDP is bad policy." He said, "I've yet to hear a coherent economic justification for this." Okay, a rationale is what he actually said, unquote. Of course, most congressional Republicans detest the HEROES Act. GOP Senator John Cornyn of Texas said on Tuesday he feels there is no urgency to pass another relief package, while Senator Lindsey Graham announced the bill was dead on arrival in the Senate. I note that Senator Lindsey Graham has now fallen behind his Democratic opponent, Jamie Harrison in South Carolina, in polling, perhaps because he announced the bill was dead on arrival in the Senate, or had said many similar things in the past. Anyway, the pic goes on, says, "No urgency, dead on arrival," grotesque language with more than 80,000 people dead and thousands more sure to follow, but there's now, I'd estimate by tomorrow morning, 85,000 people dead. But par for the course with Donald Trump's party of aristocratic brigands. Yes, they really are brigands. A vote on the HEROES Act in the House is scheduled for Friday, but Senator Mitch McConnell has telegraphed his intent to leave the bill in his inbox until the sun burns out. In the meantime, the dying will continue, fear and uncertainty will spread, and capitalism will go on cutting off its nose to spite its face. Now, I think in the meantime, while the dying continues and fear and uncertainty spreads, I think also direct action is going to start to spread. Various strikes. I think old Mitch McConnell will be seeing general strikes before all this is through, because people are not going to allow the dying to continue and the fear and uncertainty to spread without doing something about it, whatever is necessary to do about it. The HEROES Act is far from perfect in many regards and should only be considered as a step in the right direction. It is a piece of what has to happen if the nation is to come out the other side of this in some semblance of good order. I wonder if we can even hope for that. The alternative to taking these and other necessary steps is too grim to contemplate. It could become all too real all too soon. If we can pay for the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program, $1.5 trillion, and for 12 ballistic missile submarines intended to replace the aging Ohio-class fleet, $347 billion, and B-2 bomber squadrons, $40 billion, just three of the hundreds of Pentagon programs that are designed to take life, surely we can pay to save our own lives. Quote, "Yeah, but capitalism," unquote, is not a valid excuse. It is a suicide pact most people want no part of. And I second that particular motion. I certainly do. So there we are. From William Rivers Pitt, with some muffled criticism of the HEROES Act there, but I think one can tell from that if William Rivers Pitt was in the Congress, he would be voting for the HEROES Act. But there are other opinions, and we are about to encounter them as we go forward. Sorry, I am finding a problem getting to where I want to go to, so it'll take a minute. Here it is. This is a piece from Common Dreams. And let me share the screen for it. It is, of course, critical of the HEROES Act, and it's entitled Warning HEROES Act, quote, doesn't do nearly enough, unquote, and points out, okay, that a progressive group calls on House to vote down Democrats' COVID-19 bill. This article is by Jake Johnson, the staff writer for Common Dreams. I think he's probably the best staff writer for Common Dreams, actually. But the grassroots advocacy group, Demand Progress, on Wednesday urged members of Congress to vote down House Democrats' newly introduced coronavirus relief legislation, warning that the bill doesn't do nearly enough to help those in need and does far too much to help those who are not. I couldn't agree more. David Siegel, executive director of Demand Progress, said in a statement that the House Democratic leadership, quote, has repeatedly made it clear it does not take concerns of the progressives seriously, and it is actively seeking to disempower them. And he said they must oppose this bill so as to stop being taken for granted and to set us on a course that leads to stronger legislation moving forward, said Siegel. And Demand Progress, which has more than 2 million members nationwide, is one of the few prominent advocacy organizations on the progressive side that expressed opposition to the HEROES Act after examining its 1,815 pages. Other major progressive organizations announced their plans to mobilize in support of the legislation shortly after it was introduced on Tuesday. In other words, the other organizations are caving into Pelosi. While the massive bill includes much that is supported by progressives, from hazard pay for frontline workers to emergency funding for the U.S. Postal Service, Demand Progress noted that the measure excludes many proposals that we have pushed for and contains others that are highly problematic. And Siegel points out, of course, that it bails out the lobbyists. It has a bailout for debt collectors. It has a bailout for landlords. It leaves out payroll protection, expansion of health insurance to the unemployed, and funding for congressional oversight and remote voting and discussions by Congress. It also rejects a merger ban that would help ensure that the economy works for ordinary people, not for large corporations that will seek to use easy access to cash to consolidate their power. And the group pointed to a number of specific priorities that were left out of the final bill: direct payroll support, as offered by Jay Powell of Washington and others, a ban on most mergers for duration of the crisis, as offered by Representatives David Cicilline, okay, of Rhode Island, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, okay, of New York, as well as others. An allocation by the International Monetary Fund of special drawing rights to support the needs, okay, of emerging markets, is offered by Representative Chuy Garcia, okay, of Illinois, and others. An expansion of federal health insurance to the unemployed, funding for proper congressional oversight of the COVID-19 response, including funding for congressional committees, and funding for congressional modernization to support remote voting deliberations and technology modernization. Demand Progress voiced frustration with House Democratic leadership's failure to quickly approve remote voting and virtual committee hearings during the coronavirus crisis, arguing that current procedures serve to disempower progressive lawmakers in particular. The House is expected to vote Friday on a rule change that would allow proxy voting. House Democratic leaders also said they'll push for a vote on the HEROES Act on Friday, but there are progressive lawmakers that have objected to that. Okay, specifically Bajayapal and Pocan, co-chairs of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, sent a letter to Nancy Pelosi late Tuesday demanding the vote be delayed. Bajayapal and Pocan have also advised CPC members to say they're undecided on the bill when asked how they plan to vote. Okay, also Jayapal has tweeted, "I am ready and willing to make this legislation better." And, quote, "we need a full conversation and an open process so we can address this crisis before it gets worse, because if we fail to do so at this moment, it will," unquote. I consider this the kind of opposition we're seeing here, okay, from Jayapal, but to Pelosi, as opening shots in the battle for who will be Speaker in 2021 coming up. Okay, and if Pelosi simply stonewalls in this particular situation, okay, I think that it's going to work against her prospects to come back for one more term in 2021. But the way Jayapal is talking and has been talking about this particular bill, in her manner and the direct way in which she's opposing the bill, I think you're seeing shades of a direct contest between the two of them for the speakership in 2021. I think I'm seeing this anyway. I don't think, okay, that I'm imagining things. So next focuses on a specific aspect of the HEROES Act, which is really terrible, really execrable, really... I mean, for this alone, Nancy Pelosi should get her butt fired. Okay, this is another article by Jake Johnson published today. Quote, "Massive giveaway to health insurance CEOs. Democratic COBRA plan denounced as costly taxpayer gift to the for-profit health insurance industry." That's the headline. And the HEROES Act proposes fully subsidizing COBRA, an existing health insurance program that allows laid-off or furloughed employees to remain on their employer-provided health insurance plans, which very often are not too good. Under normal circumstances, COBRA is extremely expensive for individuals. It is. Okay, and recipients have to cover both their own and their employees' premium payments. But the Democratic plan would cover 100% of the premium costs through next January. COBRA expansion has the backing of a bizarre alliance of interests, including big business and some labor unions. But critics say the proposal is wildly inefficient and does not come close to matching the scale of the nation's current healthcare crisis. Subsidization of COBRA plans would leave so many uninsured and many more burdened with the high deductible of these plans, said Adam Gaffney, a critical care doctor and president of the Physicians for a National Health Program, an advocacy group that supports the Medicare for All bills. Quote, "We're facing the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. Subsidizing the insurers is not going to cut it," unquote, Gaffney said. Quote again, "We need emergency Medicare expansion for the uninsured and coverage of out-of-pocket costs for the uninsured now," unquote. And he points out that it's estimated tens of millions will lose employer-sponsored health plans in coming months. Yes, 43 million people, it was estimated. And that upwards of 7 million will become entirely uninsured. This will, of course, have deadly consequences. And he says, or he tweeted, okay, that emergency insurance expansion, okay, is urgently needed. There's a reference to an article in The Intercept that appeared on Tuesday that was very good. Okay, it was by Akilah Lacey and John Walker. And that's another article you might read. I considered it actually covering it here tonight, but I just had too much to go through. And there were some quotes on it here. End quote from the article. That's why for the federal government, fully subsidizing COBRA on a per-person basis will actually be one of the most expensive ways for the federal government to keep the coverage numbers up, and also one of the worst ways to target it, unquote. Quote, while fully subsidizing COBRA has the popular appeal of simplicity, Lacey and Walker wrote. Quote, it is inefficient, unfair, poorly targeted, could end up hurting some people, and does not even work towards closing the gaps in the nation's healthcare system. It is inequitable because much more help will go to people who previously made higher incomes, unquote. And they say, quote, not only would health insurance corporations make massive profits off the plan, profits that come at the cost of the American taxpayer. Not necessarily, but right now that's the way it might work out. But it would still leave tens of millions uninsured, okay, or underinsured. Okay. Anyway, progressives who wanted a Medicare expansion voiced dismay after discovering that the Democratic leaders who directed the crafting of the HEROES Act pitched as a bold, even a Rooseveltian solution, decided to propose a policy pushed by the insurance industry and big business. And Warren Gunnels, staff director for Bernie Sanders, the guy with the receipts, if you recall, tweeted Tuesday that subsidizing COBRA is a massive giveaway to health insurance CEOs that will leave tens of millions behind, unquote. Yeah, Warren Gunnels is the man with the receipts. And he tweeted, we need Medicare to guarantee health care for all now, but pass it on. And then there's a link to a Politico.com article, which I assume is by Gunnels. Anyway, in a statement, People's Action Director George Goel said that, quote, while including funds to keep people from losing their insurance due to job losses shows concern for people's health needs during a pandemic, the best solution would be to enroll the uninsured into Medicare so that we support people with the public program instead of handing more money to private insurance companies who put profit over people's actual health. And Sanders, okay, and Jayapal, of course, last month introduced a bill that would use Medicare to cover all health care costs for the uninsured and all out-of-pocket costs for those on private insurance plans for the duration of the COVID-19 crisis. Okay, in an April 28th op-ed before Politico, Sanders made the case for his, okay, and Jayapal's plan and warned that subsidizing COBRA would be both expensive, okay, and ineffective. But, of course, the wonderfully fiscally responsible Nancy Pelosi, who's always talking fiscal responsibility out of every side of her mouth, does what is a really fiscally irresponsible thing, and that is trying to fund a COBRA subsidization when she knows very well it would be both expensive and ineffective. In other words, she can pass expensive, okay, and ineffective bills, and somehow she is still fiscally responsible because she is who she is. Quote, not only would health insurance corporations make massive profits off the plan, profits that would come at the cost of the American taxpayer. Bernie knows better, but he always says that. but it would still leave tens of millions uninsured, okay, or underinsured, Sanders wrote. And during this pandemic, a lack of insurance means more COVID-19 transmissions and more deaths. Expanding COBRA during the pandemic would do nothing to cover those who already lacked insurance. And Sanders added, it's actually less expensive for taxpayers because unlike COBRA, the government would not be covering the cost of expensive monthly premiums to insurance corporations. Unquote. That last quote came from Bernie. So, that was against that particular bill, specifically the COBRA portion. Here are more specific arguments against the bailout, okay, of the lobbyists. This is from a column yesterday by Dave Dahan on May 12th, the unsanitized column. Let me share that for you. And the K Street bailout would apply to practically every trade group. Every one of those lobbyists on K Street. And they're not all on K Street. There are many of them who operate out of New York. There are many of them who operate out of Reston, Virginia, here. There are many of them who operate out of L.A. and San Francisco. But yes, all too many of them are on K Street in Washington, D.C. So here we are. So Joe Biden today called for an independent inspector general to review every stimulus loan given to an insider for corrupt dealing. But in a case of the call coming from inside the House, perhaps the most corrupt deal we've seen yet is the effort approved by Nancy Pelosi to allow corporate lobbying firms to get a slice of the Paycheck Protection Program loans intended for small businesses. Now we have some data on who exactly would qualify, and the answer is everyone. Last week, H.R. 6697 was introduced with 70 co-sponsors, including 54 Democrats. The bill would cut lobbying firms and trade groups organized through Section 501c6 of the tax code into the PPP program. Lead sponsor of the legislation, Chris Pappas, wrote in a press release that all 501c6 organizations with 300 employees or less would be eligible, which is virtually all of them. The sponsors claim this would mainly help local chambers of commerce through a rough patch. That is, they're not getting much in contributions, right? Because the large corporations that usually support them are being a little pinched these days. But the Democratic Policy Center, a new organization that uncovers corporate influence, analyzed IRS data, which is public for nonprofits like CC groups, finding that this provision would apply to 99.8% of all trade groups in America. That includes 727 of the 733 trade groups headquartered in Washington. Amazing, right? Amazing. 727 of the 733 trade groups. This includes powerful trade groups, like America's Health Insurance Plans, 168 employees, which reported $62 million in revenue in its last tax return. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Institute for Legal Reform, the lead lobbyists on making businesses immune from lawsuits from workers or customers who contract COVID-19 on their premises, has only 33 employees. The Koch network, C6 Stand Together, which took in $160 million in its last tax return in 2018, employs 143 people. Other groups, from the Independent Community Bankers Association to the American Chemistry Council to the National Association of Home Builders, will also qualify, and groups slightly above the 300 employee limit, like the National Restaurant Association or the American Petroleum Institute, are doubtlessly working to find a way to reclassify employees to get under the limit too. There's a link to the voluminous data set about this, by the way. Co-founder of the Democratic Policy Center, Andrew Perez, said, quote, "It's unbelievable that Congress is working to bail out big lobbying groups right now under the guise of coronavirus relief instead of helping the millions of people who can't pay rent. We won't let them sell this lobbying group cash grab as support for small business," unquote. Now you might ask me why, who just got done yesterday writing about how these witch hunts against companies getting PPP loans are counterproductive and stupid, would be so irritated by putting trade groups into the mix. After all, these loans are capped at $10 million, not a bank-breaking number for these organizations. And if the money is lying idle, shouldn't somebody get assistance and avoid being laid off? And he says, "I do think that lobbying firms getting public funds represents something different for several reasons. Making them eligible for PPP," Dave says, "would amount to Congress donating to the lobbying campaigns intended to influence them." Amazing, right? A circle jerk. They would be paying the salary in the short term of the people that come to them looking for special assistance for their corporate clients. More important, the lobbyists already got bailed out, in effect, when the corporations got bailed out. This is kind of the ultimate in double dipping. Corporations are nursed back to health by the sheer force of Federal Reserve commitments. That's the $4.6 trillion slush fund, folks. This allows them to keep their lobbying expenses up, and then lobbyists lobby for free money for themselves. Google, quote, "a lobbying frenzy," unquote, and you will find that lobbyists are not hurting during the pandemic. You can work from home and influence public policy. This is completely unnecessary. Think about, for example, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, PhRMA. Drug companies will make out like bandits with coronavirus tests, treatments, and vaccines. But PhRMA has only 276 employees and would be eligible for a $10 million top-up despite its $459 million in revenue in 2018. Third, given what we know about the revolving door and how members of Congress inevitably rotate to K Street after their service ends, this becomes a case of lawmakers giving public money to their future employers. God, this is so evil. Fourth, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin is talking about changing the law so the PPP works better for local restaurants. At that point, it really would be trade groups taking money away from the corner pizza shop. The National Restaurant Association, one of the trade groups lobbying for those changes, could try to make itself eligible for the loans ahead of its clients. The Independent Community Bankers Association or the National Credit Union Association could take a bailout when its members determine who gets PPP support. None of that makes sense. Finally, this is a political nightmare. You're going to hand out cash to lobby groups already perceived as owning the government. Now that we know that essentially all trade groups would apply, Pelosi and the Democrats supporting this can make a choice. They can reject the most corrupt proposition yet in the coronavirus response, or just move their offices over to K Street now and end the pretense, says Dave. I thought that was such a beautiful takedown. Such a beautiful takedown. Here's something else from Dave today as well. It's a continuation of this. The first states to actually tempt fate and reopen, quote-unquote, the country have found that reopening is a relative term. The restaurants are under restrictions to limit capacity to who can fit under social distancing rules. Some find it counterproductive to open under those conditions and would rather continue with takeout. And perhaps the biggest problem is the old, quote, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, unquote, problem. In fact, under the pandemic conditions, you can't even lead the horse to water. According to Open Table data gathered by Slate's Jordan Weissman, restaurants in 7 states that have, quote, reopened, unquote, remain below the average bookings by 82% or more. And Nebraska has never instituted a stay-at-home order. Their bookings are down 90%. This mirrors the crash in restaurant bookings we saw before lockdowns began. People have other options than eating out when there's a virus about. In other words, the only way to reopen the economy is to end the public health emergency. People don't really want to be warriors when the only reward at the end is a chicken sandwich at Red Robin. There's no national pride in risking asphyxiation. The real value to states from reopening is they can kick people off unemployment if they fail to show up to a reopened business that takes them off furlough. Some states are even setting up, quote, snitching, unquote, websites so workers can report their employees and get them removed from the rolls. Reopening isn't about the economy at this stage. It's about keeping people poor to preserve state budgets for what God intended, tax cuts for millionaires. But that calculation won't last. Ominously, a survey of 5 countries by Bekekist CNC finds that even after a vaccine is widely available, large numbers of people say they won't fly in planes, dine out, or go to the movies or large gatherings or use mass transit. Attitudes can change and people are likely to loosen up when the crisis lifts, but such sentiment would constitute a permanent state of depression. Fear will consume us all, not just the fearful. That, folks, was one great column, okay, from Dave Dayen. Both in relation to reopening and in relation to the bailout for the lobbyists that's part of the HEROES Act. Who does Pelosi think the heroes are? The K Street lobbyists? Are they the heroes from the HEROES Act? Someone should ask her that question. Are they the lobbyists from the HEROES Act? And one more thing wrong with the HEROES Act. One more thing wrong with the HEROES Act that I could not miss talking about, okay, today. We really have to pay attention to that. I know it's 10:30 already, but I will get to your comments shortly. I'll share the screen on this one again. Here is what is wrong with the House not being able to do remote voting. Remote voting in Congress isn't just a matter of public health. It's necessary for Democrats to wield power. This was written by Astra Taylor and David Segal on May 12, 2020. And there's a picture of old Nancy. And I do mean old Nancy. I know it's old Joe making fun of old Nancy, but that's all right. I'm entitled because I'm old Joe, right? So here we are. This week, with at least some members of Congress, at least I've never resorted to Botox. This week, with at least some members of Congress expected to be in Washington, and a 4th phase of coronavirus relief bills on the horizon. The House of Representatives needs to make remote voting a priority. This is not simply a public safety issue, as has been argued in the New York Times. It's also about being able to wield the democratic power. But Democrats are not, as Vox's Ezra Klein recently asserted, quote, governing from the minority, unquote. Rather, they are failing to govern even the House of Representatives, where they hold an ample majority. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has dragged her feet on the issue, using Congress's lack of remote voting arrangements to shore up her influence over legislation and effectively shackle progressive members of the Democratic caucus. As long as it is impossible to meet in person, progressives in Congress are effectively powerless, and House Republicans, through the minority party, have veto power over the legislation in the chamber. That is what has been going on. That's why these bailout bills have been so terrible. That's why Pelosi has been failing, because she has played it to fail by not allowing her caucus to discuss things remotely and to vote remotely. She knew people had to stay home. She didn't stay home. She stayed in Washington. She stayed away from home in Washington. She didn't go back to her district, so she could shepherd small groups of people into the house of her choosing, so that she could control the agenda better and disempower the progressives, disempower the progressive caucus, and disempower the electorate who voted for those progressive members of the House. Instead of instituting rules allowing for the House to hold committee hearings and to vote remotely when the House was last in session in March, Pelosi has spent 2 months running the House through unanimous consent procedures. This is exactly what it sounds like. That is, a measure can be blocked if any present member offers objection. By doing so, she ceded substantial control to the majority leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, and House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. The House has historically been ruled by the majority with an iron fist. Democrats should be setting the terms of the debate by passing bold bills as a negotiating tactic. Just look at the CARES Act, the third phase, of the coronavirus relief that passed in March. Pelosi could and should have had the House approve a simple, popular, progressive relief package that, for example, offered even more generous unemployment benefits, canceled student debt, and paid everybody in the country $2,000 per month for the duration of the crisis, and then dared the Senate not to pass it. She didn't, because under unanimous consent, anything more liberal than what the Senate passes will be blocked by Republicans. That's what the unanimous consent was about. It was about disempowering the Democrats and enabling the Republicans to put limits on what could be passed. And Pelosi figured she wouldn't be blamed for that because it was going on under the radar. But I'm sure Shahid Buttar knows exactly what the game is that Nancy Pelosi has been playing. And I'm sure he knows exactly how to explain that game to his future constituents in the California 10th, in San Francisco. I'm sure he can explain to his very intelligent constituents that Nancy Pelosi deliberately disempowered the Democratic caucus and the progressive caucus within the Democratic caucus so she could have an excuse for lousy coronavirus relief bills passing the Congress. Only those relief bills that would be allowed by the Republicans, giving the Republicans a veto power over those relief bills. Incredible. Anyway, the authors point to Thomas Massie trying to block her attempt to rubber stamp the CARES Act. Thomas Massie is a Republican. So he called for a recorded vote, which spurred the House leadership to fall back on its next best option for moving in a hurry under existing rules, usher a bare majority of members back to Washington to try to achieve a quorum and pass the measure using an unrecorded voice vote, quote unquote. since leadership of both parties had signed off on a $2.2 trillion corporate giveaway. It didn't matter, and remains unclear whether a majority of those voting were Republicans or Democrats. That we lack a complete accounting of who was president at the vote for such a consequential and controversial piece of legislation is a travesty. Though his actions frustrated many of his House colleagues and invited the Twitter wrath of Donald Trump, Thomas Massey's attempt to force a recorded vote was justified. Voters have a right to know where their representatives fell on the bill so they can hold them accountable. And the same goes for any major legislation moving forward. The Intercept has conducted its own roll call of members' positions on CARES. However, this point should be made, which is not made in this article. The unanimous consent procedures forced on the House by Nancy Pelosi gave voters the knowledge, if they will take hold of it, that where their representatives fell on the bills was determined by Nancy Pelosi. That what they know is that where Nancy Pelosi fell on these bills is in favor of all of these lousy bills, that she shepherded them through and prepared the context for them actually passing without resistance from the progressive side, because Nancy Pelosi structured it in that way. Many people have been critical, of progressive members of Congress, like, for example, Ocasio-Cortez and some of the other progressive members, for voting for these previous relief bills. But why would they vote for these specific relief bills when they knew there could have been better bills if they had only resisted? We have often attributed this to them caving in, but perhaps the fact is that they might have voted for the CARES bill, for example, simply because they knew that a more radical bill could not have possibly passed at that time, because Nancy Pelosi had set things up in such a way that nothing could pass unless the Republican caucus agreed. Now, the Republican caucus agreed on that particular relief bill because it was backed by big business and it was backed by the Senate Republicans. So they were in line to pass a bipartisan bill. And the progressives on the Democratic side would have had a hard time in blocking that bill anyway, because Pelosi had enough Democrats on her side, and she could always say to the progressives, hey, we can't have anything more radical in this bill anyway, because the Republicans will never agree to it, and everybody has to be here to vote. So unless we're all willing to come back here to vote, this is a take it or leave it proposition, because under unanimous consent, I've got to have the Republicans consenting. I think people did not understand that. They did not understand that this regime of legislation, which is so despicable that we're seeing now, is due to the way Nancy Pelosi has staged this. It is solely in her hands. The blame is hers alone. And we must punish her at the polls. It must be even more of an imperative to get her out of there and put Shahed Buttar in. Until remote lawmaking is in place, progressives' hands will be tied, says the authors. The more progressive a hypothetical bill is, the more likely it is that Republicans will block passing it by unanimous consent. If there's a push for a roll call vote, Republicans could kill the quorum the requirement that a majority of the members of the House be present. Unless 216 of the 233 serving Democrats are in the chamber, there are 5 vacancies in the House right now, which means a quorum is lower than it would be were all 435 seats actually filled. Meanwhile, as the crisis continues, the risk increases that representatives will be unable to travel to Washington. Sure, because many of them have to fly, to Washington. They cannot drive. There are many who can drive, but there are many who would have to fly. And flying right now, oh, God. I don't know what you do. I mean, I suppose if there's any kind of social distancing in planes, and if you have an hour flight, or an hour and a half flight, you probably could manage it, with masks, and in various other ways. But for people who have to fly from California or anywhere further west than Chicago, or a similar distance, I mean, I don't see how people could fly, especially not older people, as many of the Congress people are. As things stand, Democrats are unable to act as watchdogs. The Treasury and the Federal Reserve are managing a multi-trillion-dollar crisis response under a cloak of darkness. The CARES Act includes weak oversight provisions, including the institution of an inspector general, whose work Trump intends to frustrate, and an oversight board without subpoena power. This problem is compounded by Pelosi's appointment of Representative Donna Shalala to be her designee on this board. She couldn't have appointed a more corrupt person, than Donna Shalala. I'm assuming here she couldn't have asked Donald Trump or Jared Kushner themselves. Now, the Florida Democrat has expressed a lack of interest, in being aggressive, and was found to have violated ethics rules by failing to disclose hundreds of financial transactions she's undertaken during her year or so in office. Shades of Donald Trump, right? A meaningful oversight is more likely to be driven by House committees with relatively intrepid chairs, but only if Pelosi chooses to allow them to function remotely so they can hold hearings, demand access to information, and even issue subpoenas. The work that can be achieved in such settings can be profound. When the likely magnitude of the impact of the coronavirus was just becoming apparent in March, Katie Porter, Democrat of California, gained some notoriety for extracting a pledge from Centers for Disease Control and CDC Director Dr. Redfield that coronavirus testing costs would be covered even for the uninsured. If committees are not meeting, then this sort of exchange cannot take place. According to research by Data for Progress, 67% of people polled supported remote voting, and only 16% said the rules should not be changed. The rest were unsure. The public clearly wants Congress to keep working during the pandemic, and many legislators agree. In March, dozens of representatives signed various letters advocating for changes to House rules to allow remote meetings. Quote, we need to provide a mechanism through which Congress can act during times of crisis without having to assemble in one place, unquote. One letter with over 50 signatures insisted. The Constitution, the authors pointed out, permits each House, quote, to determine the rules of its proceedings. The founders may not have explicitly endorsed virtual voting, but they also did not prohibit it. As recently as a few weeks ago, Pelosi dismissed her colleague's sensible calls for reform, saying, quote, we're not there yet. We're not going to be there no matter how many letters somebody sends in, with all the respect in the world for that, unquote, she said. That's bullshit, of course. Under pressure, that sort of statement means all the disrespect in the world for that. Under pressure from her peers and the public, spearheaded by advocacy groups demand progress, of which David Siegel, the co-author of this piece, is executive director. The Speaker has since begun to change her tune, but because of a delay, she must navigate an increasingly complex situation. Fixing the rules requires the House to pass an amendment. If Pelosi tries to do this through unanimous consent, then a Republican will block. This means she likely needs a majority vote with a quorum present. This could happen this week when the House comes back to consider Phase 4 coronavirus relief legislation. Though there are many members who are elderly, have underlying conditions, or are in self-quarantine, thus making it difficult to secure a quorum that Democrats control. Activists and citizens pushing for a more robust response to current crisis must take note. If we want better, more humane policies, congressional decision-making procedures must be fixed first. We need a relief package that bails out the regular people, puts stringent conditions on any public funds that are distributed to the corporate sector, and protects our electoral process by guaranteeing that all citizens can safely vote by mail in November. But Democrats on the progressive side have leveraged the fight for a just recovery. If only Pelosi will allow them to use it. The pandemic has shown old rules need not apply. Even the stodgy Supreme Court, which doesn't allow video recordings or real-time audio broadcasts of its proceedings, has begun to hear cases by teleconference. Congress recently made a change to allow members to introduce or co-sponsor legislation by email. Now they must allow for remote voting and committee work. If millions of school children can learn to use Zoom overnight, Washington officials surely can too. And so, that's what the HEROES Act, is about. The reason, no doubt, why it has so many harmful provisions in it, specifically the lobbying provision, specifically the coronavirus provision, and specifically why it is absent a provision for remote voting, or other democratic things that should be in it, is because we don't have any remote voting right now. That's why Pelosi has been able to slip in lousy provisions into these particular relief bills from the beginning. And that's why this newest HEROES Act is far from being a Rooseveltian bill. Instead, it's a normal Washington crapola bill, and one that ought to be voted down right now. If they do vote on Friday, they need to vote it down. If it takes a little longer to get to Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, they need to vote it down then. They need to tell Pelosi no. They need to give her fair warning that if she persists in this kind of thing, she will not be the Speaker in 2021, either because Shahed actually defeats her, or because when she comes back to Washington, she'll be replaced by Jayapal, or by Barbara Lee, or by someone that the Progressive Caucus can actually deal with. Okay, thanks so many of you for still remaining here since I took so long with this. I'm going to consider your comments now. So thank you for staying. I hope there have been a lot of shares. Before I go on, I ought to show my banner And there it is. Please like and share and subscribe. There's my YouTube channel. And please remember my Patreon link at patreon.com, Joe_Firestone. And I will show it again. Please share, like, and subscribe. And there's, again, my YouTube channel. And please remember my Patreon link at patreon.com, Joe_Firestone. And there it is. I will now relieve you of the ticker tape parade and go back to your comments. Here we are. Okay. And Dolores has had a watch party. And Steve says the anti-internet surveillance bill just passed by one vote. Okay, Bernie Sanders abstained. I don't know what his abstention was about, okay, from that bill. It could be he just never got there to vote. It is scary. That surveillance bill is scary. Of course, it doesn't mean that the surveillance bill will necessarily pass, but it is very scary, as Sarah Williams says, okay, because it gives Bill Barr the power to do surveillance of all our internet communications at the order of Bill Barr, Trump's favorite attorney general, who acts only as the personal representative of Trump and not as the attorney general of the United States. Lana says, please put the banner up for the Patreon, okay, and YouTube. I did, Lana, but unfortunately too late. But thank you for reminding me. I did finally put it up. Sarah Williams says shared. Kay says shared. Sarah says, I was wondering what the distinction of unemployed, okay, and jobless was. Well, now I think you know, because it was covered at some length, okay, in that article by Jack Ragsmith. There's a big distinction. And Joanne says, homeless and those whose unemployment expired aren't counted. Well, those who haven't been looking for a job in the last 4 weeks are not counted. Sarah says, no wonder Trump thinks his numbers look so good. Well, of course, he doesn't think that anymore. But he used to think that when he had figures that were 3.4K or 3.5. But the reason why they look like that is that they weren't counting the people who were counted by the BLS is no longer in the labor force. Kay says Wall Street tanked again today. That's very good. The more Wall Street tanks, the better off we are, because that means that that Mitch and Trump will want to come back to the trough. They will want some further bailouts for large businesses, so the stock market can suddenly go up again. And perhaps this time we'll be able to say no to them, not until the people are served. No more bailouts for big business until all the people are served. We need to be able to stick, well, I won't say where we need to stick it, but we need a ramrod for somebody. Hello, somebody. And Kay says the Green New Deal would fix unemployment and help Mother Earth too. Yes, it would. Avromano says, I still haven't heard anything about my $1,200. No, I don't have a bank, but I should qualify for a hard copy. Yes, you should qualify for a hard copy, and then you'll have to figure out how to cash the hard copy. And by the way, it's way overdue for a postal bank bill. Sarah Williams said, if they were to forgive student loan debt right now, it would go a long way toward helping people and towards putting more money into the economy. Yes, into the real economy. Right. And not into the banks or the Treasury Department. Avromano says it would expedite the recovery at quantum speed. I'm not sure what the economic impact actually would be. Now, the study done by Stephanie and Scott Fulweiler and Marshall Steinbaum, and I don't remember whether Pavlina had a part in that, okay, or not. That study did show that if we forgave student loan debt, it would have an expansionary effect on the economy, okay, of 1%, okay, of GDP. But of course, with the economy in such a down situation now, it might be much greater than 1%, but we don't know that on the basis of a very careful projection of what impact it would have. Kay says we need to add simple banking to the post office, okay, like Bernie wanted to do. I learned today that we used to have that. The EU still has it. Yeah, it's all over Europe. Sandy says, oh, brother. And Lana says, today was the last day to follow up. Did you put in a question about the $1,200 online? Well, for me, I didn't have to put in a question because we received our stimulus checks. I guess what, about a week ago, probably something like that. Jim Bird said, "Tell it with evidence," and Avril said, "Crap." There's a question. And Kay said, "I saw that Kelton was put on the so-called task forces in Biden's campaign. Got my doubts how good it would do." Okay, but good to see. Not only Stephanie Kelton, Sarah Nelson was put on there too. But also the head, okay, of the Sunrise Movement. Her name, okay, is Varshini Prakash. Okay, was put on there as well, and Pramila Jayapal was on there, okay, as well, and Derek Hamilton was put on the task force, okay, as well. He's a very good economist, very much in favor, okay, of job guarantee programs, very strong on that, okay, has written a lot on that. And there was some others of Bernie's favorite people, okay, who were placed on it as well. Okay, but of course, you're right to doubt what impact the task forces, okay, are going to have. We cannot tell. One impact, though, might be to introduce Joe Biden to Stephanie Kelton, at least in a distant way, and then that, in turn, might lead to Stephanie's appointment on the National Economics Council, if things turn out as I think they will. I think this time it's likely Larry Summers might be blocked from the council, and that the head of it may prove to be Jared Bernstein. Jared would probably go for the appointment of Stephanie Kelton, okay, as a member of the National Economics Council, and she would probably have a bit more access to Biden and a lot of access to Jared there too. But how much she could actually influence things, I don't know. We have to remember Christine Romer during the Obama administration actually proposed a $1.8 trillion stimulus bill at the start, okay, of the administration, and the proposal never got to Obama. It was screened out, okay, by Larry Summers, and eventually turned into a proposal that was only, okay, an $800 billion proposal. If that $1.8 trillion proposal had been rammed through the House and the Senate, as it could have been by the Democrats in that time, Uh, that would have, I'm sorry, I was distracted for a moment. Okay, by Bonnie wanted to tell me something. So, okay, so Romer, if she had been able to pass her proposal, the $1.8 trillion proposal, that was so expansive that it may have resulted in ending the recession within 6 months instead of having to drag it along in various states of economic stagnation for what seemed to be 5 or 6 years after the crash. So, Kay says Social Security expansion, Kay, and Medicare for all would give me the freedom to have a life I want instead of the crappy one I have now. Yeah, it would be great for all of us. Great for all of us. Daniel Goheen says, no track tracing people. I don't know what track tracing people is, but I think we're talking here contact tracing. I think contact tracing, okay, and isolating people is simply necessary for containing the virus and for stopping the deaths, okay, of people. Avromano says, okay, Lana says to Avromano, did you make an inquiry online? Daniel Goin says, once the government is telling people to do stuff, stay in their house, and I can't go to the beach, they're no longer cover, and the people, they're a dictator, and then they no longer listen to our duties as citizens to voice our pleasure. We should not put up with these who don't know why in the world of the people that is totally going against the Constitution. They forgot their oath of office. We have to remind them, look, if we don't have testing and contact tracing, then hundreds of thousands of people in our country, maybe millions of people, are going to die. We have a national emergency now. That is the fact of the matter. If we want to shut down this virus and shut down the number of deaths, we have to test everybody, keep on testing them. We have to contact trace who they've been in contact with and test them. And we have to make sure people quarantine for 14 days. It isn't the end of the world to have that actually done. It doesn't have to go into heavy surveillance of people. Okay, it doesn't have to go into restriction of civil liberties. In fact, testing and contact tracing of the rigorous kind they did in South Korea has allowed the economy to open up somewhat again, and for people to do many of the normal things they usually did. It actually resulted in an extension of their liberty. What you are suggesting is something that's going to result in people being constantly afraid and constantly staying home until we have a vaccination that everybody can take. And of course, you probably don't believe in vaccinations either. And so therefore, you're going to insist on the rights of certain people to infect everybody else. I'm sorry. Your rights end where my nose begins. That's just the way it is. It's a very old saying. It's time that you and other crazy individualists decided that they were going to accept it. Kay says, hey, Matt Steck, I'm glad to see you here. And Sandy said, did you see your Nancy today? It looked like she was melting. Her skin was overly moist. See my Nancy today. Sarah Williams said, and he wants us all back to work, risking our lives. And Sandy says, Kay says, Sandy, she needs to melt away. L. Stephen Day says, Trump D also understands MMT, doesn't want to share that with us. I don't think he understands MMT. What he understands is that if the government wants to print money, it can. He understands that. And Daniel Goheen says no mandatory vaccines. If there are no mandatory vaccines, then I say that people who haven't actually taken the vaccine have to be quarantined from the rest of us. That, okay, is necessary. At least it's necessary until all the rest of us are vaccinated and not, okay, at risk. Avramana says, I filled out the fields, got confirmation that it was received, but the where's my payment portal, it says either I don't qualify or they haven't gotten enough information or something like that. Where are you supposed to leave Kane inquiry? I don't know. I don't know. Avril says, throw another bucket of water on her. Yeah, the Wicked Witch of the West, right? Or the Wicked Witch of the East. Avril, sure wish I could. I'd hit her with more water if I could. And I don't know who said this, but Avril said, laugh out loud, I'll bring the petrol. Okay, Pavlana said, I didn't have to do it. You better look it up again. I understood that today at end of business was the cutoff, but I don't have all the information. Best for you to check the latest info online. Kay says, there you go, Avro. And Sandy Dagg started to say something, but didn't say anything. And Rick Maynard said, enjoy yourself and go and simple shoot people's grandparents. It's less painful. Avro Mano says, thanks for the choice. I didn't see anywhere that you can respond. Thanks for the advice. I didn't see anywhere you can respond or leave Kay an inquiry. Kay says, Sandy, that would work. I used that on my first husband, and it worked then. But laugh out loud. Steve Day said, all privilege to comfortably lock down, hating and demonstrating against it, or placing COVID risks upon others. And Deborah said, present. Hi, Deborah. And Rick said, so when and how did it happen that doing smart things becomes the tyranny? And when did doing stupid things become freedom? Well, to some degree, freedom is the freedom to do stupid things. I mean, you can't always be doing right things or good things. To a certain degree, it's a freedom to do bad things. Okay, but of course, if people do bad things and others have the freedom to get together to punish them for doing those bad things. But freedom is a multi-way street. It's got to be open to everybody. And Avril says, friends, keep taking vitamin D3 because corporations want us to die for them. Yes, keep taking vitamin D3. There's now some evidence on John Campbell's program today. He pointed to a Harvard study that was done by, was it by Jennifer Manson, I think? Sure, her last name, okay, was Manson. She had done, a review of research on the subject, and she concluded that there was now hard evidence that you reduced your risk of dying from COVID-19, by 8-fold, if your the level, of vitamin D3 in your system was high enough. Or I should say, vitamin D, was high enough. If it was sufficient, at a sufficient level. If it was at, an insufficient level, your risk of dying went up, by 8-fold. And of course, also, you have a far less risk of getting a severe disease. So if you want to have the mild kind, of COVID-19, and if you want to increase your chances of living through it, then take large quantities, of vitamin D3. I believe John Campbell takes 5,000 units a day, Okay, and Bonnie and I each take 6,000 international units, okay, of vitamin D3. And we have since a few years ago when we found our vitamin D3 levels were low. Okay, says, I've seen some of my FB friends popping in and out of here, so I hope they listen long enough to help. Avril says, oh, and this stuff too. And he gave us a link to something. Was that zinc? I'm not sure what that is, but perhaps he'll tell us. And Deborah says, just watched the brand newly released Bernie Blackout video from Vice. It was infuriating and heartbreaking. Yeah, that was supposed to be a really good one coming out. Sandy said, what does that pill do? Well, if you take it in the units that I recommend, it will lift the levels, okay, of vitamin D in your system. Sarah, but most probably the first thing that you should do, okay, is go to a doctor. Make sure your vitamin D level, okay, is high enough, because for a while, for a week and a half or so, they may prescribe 10,000 units, okay, of vitamin D, but daily, give it to you, okay, in the form of a prescription, and then after that, you would be able to maintain that same level by taking about 6,000 units in the form of those little squishy things. I forget what they're called. Okay, they're not actually in tablet form. It's in, it'll come to me. Sarah Williams says, once powers are taken from us, the government, okay, is unlikely to give them back. We should always be careful what control we allow our government to take over us, our bodies, our freedom, our privacies, etc. Yeah, I couldn't agree more, especially when it comes to privacy, and especially when it comes to giving the government surveillance power. Kay says, I saw the trailer, but have not seen the whole thing yet. Deborah says, I take D3. She says, it's very well done. Kay, and Kay says, I heard D vitamins are good for the immune system. Yes, they're generally good for strengthening the immune system. Also, turmeric is very good for strengthening the immune system. Avromano says, same. Kay says, I'll have to watch on YouTube. Okay, Deborah says, I had to subscribe to Vice TV. And Kay says, I follow them on YouTube. Deborah says, cool. Avromano says, a powerful antioxidant. Saying says, I take D3, A, C, E, and B12. And I take D3. I think I do take some B12. I don't take any vitamin C anymore, okay, or vitamin E, because I get plenty of those in the other things I do, like the flaxseed oil, cottage cheese mix, okay, I take every day, and the ground flax seeds that I take every day, and the fruits and vegetables that I eat every day. Avril says, Sandy Degg stops the cytokine storm that sets in when COVID latches on in the body. And Sandy Degg says, wow. And Avril says, did you see the article about the son that is a med student gave it to his mom when they sent her home with COVID from the ER? It's all over the internet yesterday. No, I didn't see it. What was that story about? And it says, I like Warren Gunnels. Yes, so do I. He is really the man with the receipts. I think he's a lot more radical than Bernie, actually. Sandy says, Cobra is expensive. It's hugely expensive. It's hugely expensive. Sarah says, for those who are wondering about vitamin D, this is an excellent video about its importance. And she does a video there. Lana says, thank you, video. Thank you, Sarah. And Russ says, so long as Larry Summers is in Biden's mix, I will be a down ballot voter in the fall. I think I'll be a down ballot voter anyway in the fall. Romano says, Dr. John Campbell. Yes, Dr. John Campbell. Yeah. And I watch his videos every day. And Sandy says, no, I miss it. I had to go into school yesterday to shut down the library. I was beat and went to bed at 8 p.m. Alvo said, I am a groupie. And Lana said, Ross Coleman, remember when Warren Mosler called Summers out for not understanding how Fed funding actually works? Yes, I do. In fact, I remember when Warren Mosler actually explained it to Summers. And Summers claimed that he understood fully, but that he could never tell people that because they'd never believe it. Yeah, there's the story in the 7 Deadly Innocent frauds about how Warren briefed Summers on MMT. And Summers claimed to understand, but claimed it would just be politically unacceptable. He could not possibly pitch that. Sarah said, me too. In this one, he goes into COVID-19 as well. Rick Maynard says American workers are being hung out to dry during the pandemic. Steve Gonzo says there's no liability for corpse, but still in it, as if. Didn't catch that. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to watch him in over a week because my device is broken, but my roommate is letting me borrow her phone to watch this tonight. Thank you, roommate. Steve says this country is as corrupt as they come. I don't know if the country is as corrupt as they come, but business is as corrupt, okay, as it comes, and business has corrupted our government, for sure. Okay, and not only business, but also those who gain from continuing to allow the corrupt people to run the government, like the Christian right people who think that the power they're being given by this government through Supreme Court appointments and through the friendliness to the Christian right justifies their toleration and support for completely corrupt people to practice crony capitalism all over the country. I don't see how those people can go to church on Sundays. I remember when the rapper KRS-One of Boogie Down Productions tried to warn about the corporate takeover way back in the 80s. People were warning about the corporate takeover way back in the 60s. They've always warned about the corporate takeover. Of course, the people who warned about it in the 80s were seeing what was happening right then. And Kay says, Ohio set up a snitching site. Yes, they did. Lana says, the whole unemployment mess needs to be overhauled. Makes me sick. And I've had recurring periods of unemployment as a contractor. I have been through this. Oh, gee, Lana, I didn't know that you had that experience. I had recurring periods of unemployment as a contractor, too. That's why I finally went into my own small business, because I didn't want to have recurring periods of unemployment as a contractor. But then I had recurring periods of unemployment when I had to shut down the business after 10 years. So a lot of small businesses fail. Steve says, this whole thing is about the biggest movement of wealth to the top 1% in the history of this planet. And Charles Brooks Levitt says, hell no, they're not heroes. They are all traitors. Sandy said she was melting today as fast as her $26 a pint ice cream. And Rick Maynard says one of the most striking aspects of the Iroquois Confederacy's democratic deliberations is that they were required to consider the effect of their actions, not only in terms of their immediate needs, but on the effect on the next 7 generations before deciding on decision. So today I am doing just that in my rambling ruminations. And then Rick's got some links for us. Entertaining thoughts, large and small, rambling alone along Rattlesnake Ridge. Sounds great. And Matt says, Joe, thanks for posting the links for all of your references. Thanks for coming, Matt. Lana says, Pelosi is such a manipulative bitch. I know. And Sarah says, Nancy's just as shady as Debbie wants him and Schultz. I guarantee we will see rigging in this race. If she has control of the machines, we will. Sarah says, but we have to remember this is going to be a general election. In other words, it won't be like the primaries. I don't think it'll be as easy to rig this, okay, as the primaries. Kay says, Sarah, we have already seen rigging in this race against Bernie big time. What I'm saying, it may be harder to rig the general election than it was to rig the primaries. Okay, Mark says, Kay says, Mark Pocan said he had to fly back to D.C. today. Yeah, it's probably for this vote. He probably had to fly back from Minnesota. But it's not as hard to fly back from Minnesota as it is from California. Sarah says, this is why I straight up refuse to vote blue, even if I did like their candidate. The DNC does not deserve our vote. They don't. Avril says flying is too dangerous because of the ventilation system. Yeah, I agree. It is because of the ventilation system. I think that to fly, you need to wear a respirator for the whole flight. And you probably need to wear an N95 respirator. I don't even know if an N95 is enough. Kay says, Sarah, I will vote in down ballots for progressives. But past that, I can't vote for Biden. And me neither. Sandy says, they were saying one of the airlines were not leaving the center seat empty during some flights. I think it was by United, but I am not sure. They must have been violating federal guidelines then. Russ says, I need to turn in. See you again soon. Great, Russ. See you again tomorrow night. Oh, by the way, tomorrow night, Jeff Epstein is coming back. We're going over a new paper by Sam Levy on various aspects, okay, of MMT. And Jeff will be questioning me about what that paper says. And I will try to answer his questions as best I can. And Kay says California progressives are going to try for a People's Party. I hope that works. Yeah, I hope that works too. We really need that to work. But I don't think they'll be able to have that in time for the 2020 election, will they? I don't even think they're aiming for that. Kay says, hope you have a postal service in November. So do I. And Kay says, when I was a little kid, the family doctor used to give me zinc shots. And Lana says, Goheen is a troll. He makes the same comments all the time. Avril says, Ruth, thanks. I don't have to worry. And Avril says, Derek Hamilton, the guy that introduced the baby bonds. Yes, the very same. And Rick Maynard says, yes, we'll give you a couple of months, K, of BMI, and we'll get rid of Social Security. Okay, I'm almost done. I missed a few, so please forgive me. Solana says, Goheen is a troll. He makes the same comments all the time. I noticed he has that tendency, but he's made one or two good comments somewhere, okay, along the way. Alvaro says, Goheen, do you bitch like that if you have to stay if there's a disaster heading your way and you need to protect yourself and your family from imminent harm? And Kay says, going to pay off my credit card. Then my $1,200 will be about gone, but so will my debt, so that will be good. Avril says, yes, there's freedom and there's freedom. And Avril Mena says, thank you for the Dr. Campbell update. Kay says, when I was a little kid, the family doctor used zinc shots, gave me zinc shots. And Sandy says gummy, and Avromana says, oh, the Christian right is organized and gain power via Project Blitz. And Kay says, love Jeff. Well, you'll see him back tomorrow night. And Rick Maynard says, keep pushing him. It seems to be working. Joe Biden calls for rent forgiveness during the coronavirus epidemic. That is a new move by Mr. Biden, and a welcome one. I hope he pushes for it. He needs to push. We want to see him push. Okay, I've been through the comments. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying so long. I hope to see you all again tomorrow. And thank you for sharing and subscribing. And once again, don't forget my Patreon account. I'll flash my banner one more time. And there it is. Please remember my Patreon link at patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And good night to everybody. And I'll see you tomorrow. And Kay says, thank you for this discussion. I love these discussions. Thank you, Kay. And Rick says, night, everyone. And Lana says, good night, all. Sandy says, thank you, Joe and Bonnie and everyone. And thank you, Sandy. It was good to see you back today. And Matt says, good night, all. And good night to you, Matt. And I'm going to end the broadcast. Ending.